Hello everybody, this video will be about an idea in evolution called speciation. As you could tell, the word speciation has the word species right in it. So we're going to be talking about how a new species can develop. And this is a very important idea to the process of evolution. So if you look at these two animals, here we have a Chihuahua and here we have a Saint Bernard. They are considered the same species. Okay, and what that means is they're both dogs, and their scientific name would be Canis familiaris. So same species. I would make the argument that these two animals aren't really all that much the same. They have a lot of similarities, but this Chihuahua right here is probably about the size as this St. Bernard's head. Okay? And there are a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences going on here too. Let's look at some other creatures. I would say these two creatures, here we have a horse, and you all know here we have a zebra. These are considered a different species from each other. They're closely related, but they're not in the same species. I would make the case, just looking at these things, they look a lot more similar than that Chihuahua and St. Bernard do. Okay, but scientists say Chihuahua and St. Bernard, same species. Horse, zebra, different species. So we have to get at what is the criteria to be in the same species as another creature. So you guys know me. We're going to start off with the definition here. Here's what a species is. This definition is actually a little technical, but we can understand it. It's a population of similar organisms. All right, well, this is a little subjective. Similar. This basically means similar in appearance and in their anatomy. Okay? They are able to breed with each other. Okay, that means they can mate and they can have offspring. The third part of this definition is right here. Those offspring need to be fertile. Fertile means able to have their own offspring. It's the opposite of being sterile. Okay, so to be in the same species, number one, they have to be similar. Number two, they have to be able to mate together and make kids, make offspring. The third criteria is that those offspring have to be able to have their own children, to be able to make their own egg and sperm. So that's what it means to be in the same species as one another. Okay, now here's an example. Humans belong to the species Homo sapiens, okay? So this is a name called the genus name, and this is the species name right here. So all humans belong into this scientific system of naming. We're all in the same species together. Now, let's go back to our example here. This Chihuahua and the St. Bernard are both dogs. All dogs can mate with one another and make offspring. So, and those offspring would be fertile. So that's what this is talking about. You would have a St. Bernard Chihuahua mix, and maybe you'd call that a mutt or something like that, and that would be able to have its own puppies. That's why they're considered in the same species, even though they were bred in different parts of the world to do different jobs, and they look quite a bit different. These are more similar, so they fit the first part of our species definition, which is right here. So they are similar. Horses and zebras can breed. They make something that looks like this. Okay, I don't know if you'd call that a zorse. I think that's what it's called. Or hebra, or whatever. But their offspring are not fertile. They can't make their own babies. Okay, I didn't look it up. I'm not sure if they don't make egg or sperm or exactly what does not happen there. But for the zebra and the horse, they are similar organisms. They can have a baby together, but the baby cannot have its own children. It is not fertile. So that disqualifies them from being the same species. Okay, so there, we defined what a species is. Here's another example. Here's a horse. Here's a donkey. They can make an animal called a mule. And mules are extremely strong, great endurance, great work animals, but mules are not, they're not fertile. The only way you get more mules is by crossing horses with donkeys. So horse and donkey are not in the same species because this offspring is not fertile. So that disqualifies the parents from being in the same species as one another. Even though, I mean, unless you studied horses or you knew a lot about horses, to me they look really similar. I could probably mistake one for the other sometimes. But again, it's because their offspring are not fertile. Then these, I'll put a little X here, are not in the same species. So that's what a species is. Similar organisms, can breed to make offspring, and the offspring have to be fertile. Okay, so now we got to talk about, well, how can a new species come about? Okay, we all know that new species, they do come about. Okay, it could just be a slight variation of an existing species, but now all of a sudden it's in its own grouping and it can't mate with ones that look like it anymore because something happened. That's called speciation. It's an event that produces two or more separate species from one original species. So think about it. You have one species of whatever they are here, and then all of a sudden something happens where the group gets split apart, and then over time now you have two species. If you put these two species together, they would no longer make a fertile offspring anymore. That's what we're talking about. How a new species can come about from an existing species. So, since being a member of one species is defined by the ability to successfully reproduce and have offspring that can have their own children, speciation, or like right here where these things diverged here, that involves the inability to reproduce with one another. Now, what happened here with this little arrow I put right here, what happened was they got split apart and they were no longer able to get to each other to mate anymore. And it stayed that way, and natural selection worked on each of these long enough that this one over here is now different enough from this group of organisms. No, we're not talking about one organism, talking about groups of organisms. They are different enough from each other where they can no longer mate together. So we'd say speciation has happened, and now we have two different species. Oh, here's a great question. All right, well, how does that happen? How do you go from one species to something and now you have two? I mean, it's really not disputed that dogs evolved from wolves. So here you had, where are we going? Here you had wolves. Sometime over the course of human history, people realized that there were some wolves that would kind of hang around, and if you fed them, they didn't want to kill you. Okay, and they actually had some value for protection or hunting or whatever it might be. So people started selectively breeding the gentler wolves so that they would tolerate being around people and could be companions and could be helpful. And eventually, you got different types of dogs. Well, the other wolves that we didn't domesticate, they just kept doing their thing, and they're still wolves. So now we have two species. We have species of animals called dogs and species called wolves, but they came from the same ancestor group, which was wild wolves maybe thousands of years ago. So that's called speciation. How did it happen? That's what we got to look at here. For many species to come from one, like our dogs and wolves examples here, they had to have become reproductively isolated from one another. What that means is it means that the groups, right here where my lines diverge, those groups could not get to each other to mate anymore. So then what happened was, they're now reproductively isolated, and they can't get to one another, and natural selection works on them differently. In the case here of dogs, it was artificial selection. We started breeding the dogs to maybe be better swimmers or faster runners or better hunters or companions or to hunt certain animals or whatever it was, and that's how we reproductively isolated them. These domesticated dogs, we don't let them go into the wild and mate with wolves anymore. So that's the reproductive isolation, is that humans stepped in and we reproductively isolated them. All right, well, there's a few ways where reproductive isolation can occur. And we're going to go through these a little bit quickly, but you guys know the beauty of watching a video is you can pause things and rewind them and look it up and find other examples and then come back to it. So the first way that it could happen, and these don't go in any particular order, is something called temporal isolation. The word temporal means time. So you had an original species group that experienced a split in the population. Okay, maybe there was 1,000 of these, and 200 went this way and 800 stayed over here. But this is the reproductive isolation. And temporal means there was a time difference. Let me show you what we mean by that. Not that one. Here we go. So there's these two frogs. We have a wood frog on the left and a leopard frog on the right. And the idea here is these came from the same ancestor frog. And then there was a split, a reproductive isolation. And then we got the wood frog, and now we have the leopard frog. These two frogs, they mate at different times. And with animals, they mate at a certain time of the year usually, and that's it. They're not interested in mating at any other time other than that mating system. So if you guys take a look, the wood frog mates between March and early April, whereas the leopard frog is the middle of April. Well, when these guys start wanting to reproduce in March, the leopard frogs aren't interested. And when the leopard frogs, they get ready to mate in mid-April, these guys are done. So it's a difference in time. They're not mating at the same time, and that's what made the split. It was a temporal isolation. Okay. Geographical isolation means that one group got put to a different place than the other ones, and they physically could not get to one another anymore. The most famous example of this is Darwin's Galapagos turtles. These tortoises, I should say, have different features. If you look, this one has a longer neck to reach higher fruit. This one's a bit more compact to stay along the ground. Darwin found that different tortoises live on different islands. And the idea here, South America would be way over here, is that a storm took some ancestor group of tortoises, or maybe people even did this, and put them on these different islands. And because they couldn't swim, the ones here couldn't swim over to the ones here. They were reproductively blocked by this part of the ocean. Natural selection made the tortoises here, we'll call them A, different from the ones over here. And they were different from the ones here and here. And if you would take ones from this island and put them over here, they will no longer breed because they're not the same species anymore. That's called being geographically isolated. There's also behavioral isolation, where all of a sudden this little split right here is because some of the groups start doing a different mating dance or singing a different song or whatever it is, and only certain females are attracted to that and other ones aren't. So you get a split because they're attracting different members of the group. And that's a great example here is birds. Okay, the idea here is these birds are really similar, so maybe hundreds or thousand or so years ago they were all the same group. But then some of them started singing a different song, and the other one stayed to the original song. And now you have this reproductive isolation of behavior right here, where only ones that like the song this kind sings will breed with this kind, and other kinds will only breed with this one because they like the song that one sings. That's behavioral isolation. Okay, so it's this splitting right here, this reproductive isolation that divides the group. And if you were to put these two birds together again, they wouldn't even attract one another, because with birds that song is so important, and they wouldn't even think to mate with each other. They just see each other as competitors now. All right, and then another example is mechanical isolation, whereas natural selection worked on the bodies of the organisms, whereas they can't even mate together. The sperm can't reach the egg anymore because of the way the bodies have developed over time. And here's an example of that. We have this black sage and white sage. If you weren't a botanist, you really would have no idea. I'd probably think they were the same thing until I looked at them really closely. But it says here the hybrids rarely form because the flowers have become specialized for different pollinators. The black sage are pollinated by smaller bees, and the white sage by larger bees. So a smaller bee is going to stick to the same kind of flower and spread that one's pollen around. It's really not going to come over to this one because maybe it can't reach the nectar as easily. The same thing is true of the large bees. It's going to stick to these because it can get the nectar out easily. Over here, it's probably not going to do it as often. So they have been mechanically isolated. The structure of the flowers prevents them from attracting the same pollinator to take pollen from this one and bring it over here to this one. Okay, so mechanical isolation based on the physical structure of these flowers prevents them from interbreeding. And now, guys, whenever you see a scientific name like this, this is the species name. You could see they have a different species name because they're different species. A long time ago, they may have been the same species, but now they're different because they become reproductively isolated. Okay, so in the closing seconds here, what's the point of all this? A central idea to any kind of evolution is this idea of new species can develop, and we call that speciation. It happens because of becoming reproductively isolated, and there's more methods than just those four, but those are the four that we took a look at.